Okay. Good morning. I'm Becca Cole, president of the Friends of the Montana Historical Society, and I'm happy to welcome you to our lecture today. Diana DiStefano grew up on the central coast of California and moved to the Mountain West when she was 18. She studied history at Colorado College, waited tables in Steamboat Springs, and learned to ski when she was 25, which is old, in case you want to know, for learning to ski. She attended the University of Montana in the late 1990s, where she earned a master's degree. Go Grizz, eh? She wrote a thesis on the economic and environmental impacts of skiing on Whitefish, Montana. Deciding she liked school better than work, she went to the University of Colorado and earned a PhD. Her dissertation, now a book, is the topic of today's talk: how 19th century newcomers to the Mountain West adapted to their treacherous environment. After school, Diana followed an academic track and worked at Pacific Lutheran University, Bucknell, and the University of Alaska, Fairbanks. She taught everything from world history to a course called Sex in the West. She's not talking about that today. Yes. She missed Montana, though, and dreamed of moving back here someday. Finally, the stars aligned, and Diana was hired by the Montana Historical Society to run the publications program in July of 2018. Diana DiStefano.
All right. Is this fancy contraption on? Is it on? Is it on now? Is it on now? Yes. Okay, you can hear me. This is the first time I've ever used a mic like this. It makes me feel like a rock star. So thanks for coming today. I'm going to talk a little bit about, in case you're wondering, slim but important book that I wrote here, Encounters in Avalanche Country. And I'm going to talk, just tell some stories from my research and my writing that I think illuminate some of the challenges that Euro-Americans encountered when they moved to the Mountain West in the 19th century and early 20th century. But I'm also going to talk a little bit about some of the unexpected ways that people responded to disasters, including, I'm going to take a side trip into a little bit of legal history. So I actually hope there are no lawyers here today in case I mess that part up. But let me talk a little bit first about how I got interested in this topic. As Becca mentioned, I moved to a ski town after college, and that's when I learned to ski. First, I lived in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, and I spent a couple years in Lake Tahoe in California as well. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting was as I was driving to work, sometimes they would close the road for avalanche control. And I was curious about that, and I learned that they were using World War II howitzers to blast the slopes when they thought avalanches were threatening. And I thought, well, that seems like interesting technology to be using. I mean, this was in the 1990s, so quite a bit past World War II. So I got a little bit interested in modern, contemporary avalanche control. But as a historian, of course, you start to think backwards, and I thought, well, if ski areas and mountain highways are having to deal with avalanches and snow removal, what in the heck did people do in those mining towns in the 1870s and 1880s? Because surely they had to contend with similar environmental problems: the long winters, the deep snow, the cold temperatures, the occasional avalanche disaster. And so that's really where my research questions started. And I remember going to my advisor at the time, who was Patty Limerick at the University of Colorado, and I said, I want to write a dissertation on historic avalanches. And she just laughed and said, good luck. She really didn't think I was going to find much information, but it turns out one of the sort of fortuitous things about studying disasters is people leave a record of them. It's hard to find out sort of the mundane day-to-day way that people deal with where they live. But when there's a disaster and when there's loss of life, people tend to record it. And that's sort of it's heartbreaking to study disaster, but also as a historian, it's something of a boon because you can find the sources. And so that's really the genesis of my project. And so I just want to give you a little bit of background here on how I chose where to study. And this is obviously a world map of avalanche zones around the globe. And it's obvious there are some real places. You can't call them hot spots, I guess, but there are definitely areas, the Himalayas and the Alps in Europe, and of course, if you look at North America, there's an obvious part of the country where you have the most frequent avalanche, or that are most prone to avalanches, and so I had somewhat limited resources as a graduate student, so I ended up studying Colorado, Utah, and Washington, and I was fortunate to go into to spend a little bit of time in British Columbia as well. And so that was how I chose my research sites. And I apologize, this map is terrible. It's really, really blurry. But if you know anything about Western geography, you can probably tell where we are roughly. These super smudgy things that are supposed to be words are the various sites that I focused my research on. So they say things like Silverton, Colorado, and Revelstoke, British Columbia, but I apologize. This is, not always the best visual aid there, but it gives you kind of a sense of my study area. And I decided to begin by looking at the first Euro-Americans who went west. So of course I began with trappers and traders and in the 1820s. And I discovered that they wrote quite a bit about the environmental challenges that they encountered, from frostbite to snow blindness. Who knows what snow blindness is? Do you all know what that is? When the sun reflects off the snow, and it starts with sort of like a sunburn to your eyeballs is sort of one way to think about it, but it can be so severe that you can go temporary blind, and apparently it's so painful that it even kind of can drive you insane, so you don't want that to happen. But trappers wrote some about these kinds of conditions, and but a lot of them were really sort of relying on their own know-how, and so a lot of the skills they acquired were either from people who had more experience than them or just through trial and error. So one of the things that trappers discovered, and I'm just going to skip to a better picture here. One of the things that the trappers discovered was that when there's a lot of snow on the ground on a sunny day, it gets really soft, and so it's really hard to travel, especially if you're on horseback. And so they learned that it was sometimes better to travel at night or really early in the morning when the snow still had a nice thick icy crust on the top. And, again, that seems perhaps like a sort of a minor acquisition of knowledge, but these kinds of little tricks were really what enabled people to go about their work in these places. And so some of the skills that the trappers acquired were transferable to some of the earliest, the sort of next wave of newcomers who were the prospectors and miners. And again, you have a lot of people who don't necessarily have any specific experience in an extreme mountain environment, but they have to learn pretty quickly or suffer the consequences. So I mentioned snow blindness earlier. One of the things that miners, first in California in the 1840s and 50s, and then in Colorado and Utah in the 60s and 70s and into the late 19th century, was what to do about snow blindness. And so they did everything from, how football players smudge under their eyes. They take charcoal and smudge it around their eyes, thinking that would help deflect some of the sun's rays. They would make goggles They would wear veils. They would sort of, again, some of it was trial and error, but that was one of the critical things. If you wanted to move about in the mountains, if you wanted to work in the wintertime, you needed to know how to protect your vision. Obviously, that would be really critical. Another thing would be able to bring supplies to your claim. And so a lot of mountain miners depended on donkeys or burros, who were generally considered to be more sure-footed in mountain, sort of on steep and rocky terrain than horses. And you can see this fellow here with his arms around his donkeys. I think this is a really sweet picture. But it actually is an important picture too, because miners didn't just depend on their donkeys to carry their supplies. They also sometimes depended on them when traveling became really difficult. And I found this really funny account. It was a story by a miner, and he wrote about something he called tailing. And I'm like, tailing? What could tailing possibly be? So I kept reading, and he said, sometimes when the snow is particularly deep or it's particularly slippery, I grab a hold of my donkey's tail and allow him to lead the way. And so I have this, I wish I had a picture of that. But apparently this was, a common technique was to really use your pack animals as an aid as you're moving about on this difficult terrain. And I should probably mention, why were these guys here in the middle of winter? Well, of course, the allure of gold and silver does not stop for the season. And so a lot of these prospectors were going into the mountains at times of the year that really even Native American people had not been in those places previously, because I like to say the Native Americans were smart enough to know that going up to 9,500 feet in Colorado in the middle of winter is just a really bad idea. But again, the allure of gold and silver is a draw. And so these guys really relied on their pack animals. There was one fellow who claimed that he was buried in an avalanche, and his 2 burros dug him out and saved his life. So a touching story there. But this was a really an important tool that aided these mountain miners. Another important tool for mountain miners, and then the communities that built up around them, the people who came to these places for services, but also preachers, mailmen, people who needed to move around in the wintertime, they also depended on skis. And so I'm sure some of you know a little bit about early ski history, but it was the 49ers in California that really started. Skis came from Norwegian miners who introduced ski technology to other immigrants to California. And the first, I think I do have a picture. The first skis, as you can see here, were usually between 7 to 10 feet long. They were often 4 inches, they were like powder skis, right? Like 4 inches thick, a couple inches tall. And they were often just hewn out of logs, so extremely heavy as well. But learning to make and use skis was something that the miners adapted, and they called them snowshoes, which can be confusing when you're doing research, because at first I thought, oh, all these guys are running around on racket-style snowshoes, and I'm like, they're talking about gliding and races, and I'm like, well, that doesn't make any sense. So I had to educate myself on the terminology. And miners did also use racket-style snowshoes as well, but skis, and particularly in Colorado, skis became a really common tool. And actually, I'm not going to read hardly anything out of this book, but I did want to read this one little passage, because I think it kind of captures the importance of skis and how ubiquitous they were as well. Dr. Gardner was an East Coast physician who came to Colorado in the I think early 1880s, if I'm remembering correctly. And he wrote, "Deep snow made it impossible to clear the roads or trails, and very early in the history of these camps, the long, narrow snowshoe, the Norwegian ski, was introduced. Nothing surprised me more in my first sight of this strange settlement than to see people going about on skis. Everyone used them quite as a matter of course and slid over the top of the deep snow with the utmost skill. Even little children, just able to walk, were flying about on their little snowshoes." So, obviously a very important tool. And skis were important, of course, for transportation, but as I mentioned as well, miners enjoyed a little bit of recreation too, and ski races were popular all across the Mountain West in the late 19th century. And there would be these sort of bragging contests between, it was like between Silverton and Rico in Colorado, and the Silverton miners would brag, we're the fastest skiers in the San Juans, and we're gonna beat you next week at the big ski meet. And the other guys would say, no, we have a secret dope recipe. Dope was like the wax they put on the bottom of their skis. A secret dope recipe that ensures that we are going to beat you. So it was really created these kind of interesting rivalries. But again, the recreation was really a survival tool that was parlayed, into something else. So being a really good ski racer actually meant your chances of survival were probably higher too. So kind of an interesting overlap there. Over time, of course, prospecting turned into, I'm sure you all know, there's really not so much, usually not a lot of gold just lying around on the ground. To really get to the good stuff, you have to dig underground. The introduction of dynamite, of course, made an important impact and helped with the transition to industrial mining in the Mountain West, which happened fairly rapidly in these mountain towns. And one of the things that I think is really interesting, if you look at this picture, what do you notice about that hillside above the town? It's steep. There's nothing there. If you look kind of really carefully, you might be able to see there's some stumps. And so, of course, this is Central City in Colorado. But, of course, in the building of these mining towns, people would cut down the trees that were closest at hand, right? That makes perfect sense. But what they did was they created sort of these perfect environments to increase avalanche danger. Because one of the things that helps keep snow in place on a steep slope are trees. And so inadvertently, and Central City is just one example, but really if you look at a lot of these, like Alta, Utah, for example, you'll see really similar situations where they've really created a perfect environment to increase their danger. And so the connection, interestingly, between cutting down all these trees and increasing avalanche danger was made pretty quickly. And in Alta in the 1870s, there was actually a series of editorials in the newspaper criticizing the practice and saying, you're increasing everyone's danger by cutting down these trees. And that really surprised me, because I think I went into this project thinking that people in the 19th century would just be like, oh, who knows, act of God, wrong place, wrong time, I knew I shouldn't have been such a blasphemous sinner. These are sort of like my preconceptions, but it turns out, miners, mountain people are pretty practical, good observers of their environment, and we're really astute in terms of connecting these dots. And so, at least in my mind, it's really quite remarkable how soon mountain people were talking about, well, what are the conditions that cause avalanches? And so the idea of clear cutting basically was something that was fairly well known and understood. Also, avalanches tend to follow, they often follow ravines. There's a couple different kinds of avalanches. There's slab avalanches, which are like on a ridge when snow would break off horizontally, and you'd have like a big kind of slump of snow come down. And then there's ravine avalanches that tend to follow the contours of a mountain. And one of the things that these early mountain residents also recognized, along with clear cutting, was that especially the ravine type of avalanches tended to be fairly follow the same path every winter. And so, again, to me, something that was really remarkable about looking at these people was that really by the 1870s, 1880s, they had a good idea of when avalanches were going to happen, what conditions caused them, and that they were somewhat predictable, not entirely predictable. And so that really puts a different spin on how they conceived of their environment. And there are just dozens of examples of people writing about, well, I made sure to put my cabin in a safe place. So if you have a concept of where is safe and where is unsafe, you're really, it's really kind of putting a point on this idea of knowledge of their environment and really feeling like they could increase their safety up to a certain point. But of course, with the advent of industrial mining, a lot of times where the jobs are or where you're asked to go to work are not actually under the individual's control. And so one of the problems that occurs as industrial mining takes hold is a lot of times, again, you see, and here's the Liberty Bell mine near Silverton, Colorado, which was the site of multiple avalanches in the late 19th century. You have people really, in the course of doing their jobs, are put in danger. And so the late 19th century is not a period particularly known for workers' protection, workers' rights, or even workers' compensation, of course. And so they really had little recourse. And even though Mountain West miners are known for their labor militancy, for creating unions and advocating for their rights, they really focused on bread and butter issues like wages and hours. And I kept hoping I'd find that smoking gun where a bunch of miners walked off the job because of avalanche danger, because I was like, oh, that would just be that would be fantastic. I never did find that, but I sure found a lot of complaints and concerns about being asked to go to work under unsafe avalanche conditions. Just give me a second here. I'm getting over a cold, so I'm... Other kinds of technology also encouraged the further development of mountain mining. Again, so basically welding together the problems that come with working in the mountains, but also increasing the number of people put in harm's way. This is an aerial tramway, and these were built basically to transport supplies and people to the mines, and then the ore from the mines. And these are just sort of marvels of technology in a way, but what they allow people to do is to work in more extreme environments and year-round, because they're also elevated, so they can work when there's a lot of snow on the ground, but it also eliminates the need. I mean, it would be really difficult to build a road or a spur line, a railroad line up to some of these mountain locations that are at extremely high elevations, very steep terrain. But these kinds of aerial tramways allow for that. Other kinds of technology, of course, hoists, pumps, machine drills, and of course the biggest technological boon to the industrial development of the West is the railroad. And so, again, I started this project interested in miners, and I naturally ended up gravitating to looking at railroad workers as well, because who else is working in the mountains but the people who are working on the trains? And again, I think there's a lot of stories we're familiar with about the difficulty of building the first transcontinental railroad through the Sierra Nevada mountains, but it wasn't just, it was difficult to blast through the rock. One of the biggest challenges was dealing with snow problems and avalanches, and it's on the Transcontinental Railroad in California that you see some of the first experiments with technology to protect rail lines from avalanches. And so snow sheds are sort of one of the big innovations that the, let's see, I think I'm going to skip ahead to a picture of a snow shed for you since I'm talking about that. So a snow shed, this one is fairly primitive, but the idea is basically, and this I think is really interesting. It speaks to the idea of predictability, because you certainly wouldn't go to the expense of building a snow shed over a section of rail line if you didn't think an avalanche was going to fall there. Why would you think an avalanche was going to fall unless you had some idea of what kinds of conditions created snow slides? And so the idea would be that this slope here, again, no trees, fairly steep. This is Alpine Pass in Colorado. It gets a ton of snow. And the idea is if a slide were to come down, it would just go over the top of the shed. And therefore, you wouldn't have to go to all the trouble of digging out this particular section of track, repeatedly every single winter in order to keep the line open. And instead, you would build these sheds strategically in places to help keep the rail lines open. So this is happening simultaneously with some of these other developments, like I talked about, mines being built in more and more extreme places, workers becoming part of an industrial workforce. What's interesting, of course, too, about this period of time is there's certainly no kinds of emergency response like we have now. Most of these towns didn't even have a fire department or a police department. And so the usual way that people responded to disaster was really volunteers. And so it's interesting that, I don't think it's altruism to help people you don't know who might be buried in a slide. It might almost be like sort of hoping for reciprocity would be a better way to think about it. Because what ends up happening in a lot of these disasters is that men, when they hear about a slide, if there's other men trapped, they will come to help dig them out, putting their own selves at risk. On the other hand, a month later, they could be the victim of a slide, and they would certainly hope that somebody would come and dig them out. This photograph, I think, is really poignant and also representative of the kinds of ways that communities responded. The men all standing here are helped with a rescue, but this is actually a body on a sled, someone who did not survive an avalanche. And typically, if you're not, you can survive for about 15 minutes if you're buried in an avalanche. It's very rare to survive for much longer than that. So your odds of surviving if buried, especially in this period of time, were not particularly good. But again, the sort of community response, I think, is quite remarkable. And it wasn't just to try and uncover, hopefully, living victims, but also the efforts to get the bodies out as well, so that there could be burials. And again, a lot of times the burials were paid for by donations from people within the community. And so it really was a community response when these kinds of disasters happened. Becca, how much time do I have? Okay, perfect. Okay, sorry, I wasn't keeping very good track. So here was a snow shed. I wanted to talk about, well, here's a snow shed. You can see sometimes they don't always do their job very well. It's interesting to me, they built it nice and strong. It didn't collapse, but the slide came right through the back end of it, so oops. So I mentioned I wanted to talk a little bit about some interesting court cases, and so I'm going to start with this one in 1884, and Woodstock, Colorado doesn't exist anymore. It has since gone back to nature. But for quite some time, the Denver, South Park, and Pacific was interested in building a rail line. It was from Denver to basically Durango. And Alpine Pass caused them all kinds of problems. It was always a really difficult section to keep open in the wintertime. And in fact, there were several winters that they had to close it down. But there was a station stop, a section house, a boarding house, a saloon, and a few other things near Alpine Pass. And there was also Alpine Tunnel was there too. Anyway, in 1884, a tremendous avalanche came down, and it basically demolished every single building. It buried all 19 people that were there at the time. One guy, sometimes I think these stories are a little bit apocryphal, but just bear with me. One man escaped. He dug himself out of the snow. He stumbled 10 miles to Pitkin, which was the nearest settlement, and raised the call that there had been a terrible avalanche, that people were buried. A bunch of volunteers put on their skis. They went up to Woodstock, and they began digging out the victims. There were some survivors, but the family I want to focus on, it's a really tragic story. Marcella Doyle she ran the boarding house, and 8 of her children worked there with her. Her sons all worked for the railroad, and her daughters helped her at the boarding house. And they were young. They were all under 20, all of her children. And they were all caught in this particular slide, and six of her children died. So just a really traumatic experience. What's interesting about Marcella Doyle is that she decided to sue the railroad, the DSP&P, which is a subsidiary of, which one was it? The Union Pacific. So, part of a really big corporation. She sued them, and she filed 2 lawsuits. The first one was for personal injury, and the second one was for the loss of income, potential income that her dead children could have earned. Okay, and essentially what her suit claimed was that the railroad knew that the boarding house was below an avalanche, a known avalanche path, and that they didn't tell her, and therefore she did not know the risk when she moved her family to that place. And so essentially her suit had to prove that the railroad was negligent. And as I mentioned, the late 19th century wasn't a particularly labor-friendly time. Most of the laws favored corporations in these matters. And one of the tenets of common law was this idea of assumed risk. And that's really what Marcella Doyle was going after. Assumed risk is this idea that if someone is hired for a job and they know it's dangerous, they assume the risk of that job, right? Marcella argued she didn't know her job was dangerous, and so therefore she did not know what risk she was assuming. And so I won't get into the legal details here too much, but I just think it's remarkable that a woman in the 1880s would take on a giant corporation in a suit like this, and there was really no precedent for it. There weren't like 10 other people who'd successfully sued the railroad, for, injury or death in avalanches. She ends up losing her case, but she appeals it, and again, remarkable, it goes all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. So she appeals her case all the way to the Supreme Court. Now, why in the world would the Supreme Court take on an obscure avalanche case from Colorado? And the answer is because it raises so many important questions about negligence and responsibility in this age of industrialization. These are new problems. Workers killed in these kinds of accidents. What about if there'd been passengers stopped over at the station when this had happened? What would be the responsibility to them? And so the Supreme Court hears this case, and it's one of those, it's very twisty and turny. And what they end up deciding is that the railroad did know that it was a dangerous location. But they determined that Marcella is actually not an employee of the railroad because she is not paid directly by the railroad as the person who runs the boarding house. She's paid by the railroad workers. And it makes me so mad because here they write this, eloquent, sort of decision about the nature of slides, why, knowing about when they might happen, all the evidence, and yet she still loses because they decide the laws that apply to renters are even less protective than the ones that apply to workers. And so, yes.
But if any of the railroad workers had been killed in that slide as they're staying in her boarding house, then maybe they would have had
They might have had a chance at it. And, it's hard to know, with these, was this a test case of some kind? Maybe they picked the wrong client for this. But it really is I find it a fascinating story and a tragic one, of course, as well. And and it's actually a precursor to some developments that will happen later on. So here's the Supreme Court reporter. This is part of the decision. It was alleged that the section house was built near the base of a high and steep mountain and a place subject to snow slides and dangerous on that account, that the company was aware of said danger, that the plaintiff and her children had never before resided in a region of country subject to snow slides and had no knowledge of snow slides, and that the company did not at any time notify or apprise the plaintiff or her children of the danger. So even though she loses, in some ways it does establish an opening to future cases. I'm going to move us now geographically over to Washington, and I will just talk briefly about this case. This is probably the most famous avalanche in American history. It happened in 1910. It's the most deadly avalanche in American history. It killed 97 people. The situation was there was a huge storm. There was a passenger train and a mail train that were heading to so heading to Seattle. And if any of you have ever driven from here to Seattle, you know there's that final push over the Cascades, which can be pretty messy driving in the wintertime. So essentially, this was the last, sort of going over the Cascades. Wellington, Washington it's on Highway 2. I haven't been there in so long now. I can't remember what the pass is up there. It's not Snoqualmie Pass, is it? That's Stevens Pass. Thank you. That's it. It's right near to the west of Stevens Pass. Thank you. Anyway, these trains got trapped at a stop. There was a hotel and a saloon and a few other things here by avalanches on either side. So basically, they were stuck there waiting for the spring, yeah. Rotary plows, shovelers, basically people, shoveling out by hand, and they were stuck there. And it's this really like horrible story because they get scared. The passengers are sitting on this train. It's snowing. They're looking up the mountain. They know there's avalanches all around, and they're like, this is not a place they want to be. And they are stuck there for a week. And finally, some of the passengers, some men, decide they're going to hike out. And so on February 28th, some of the male passengers hike out, and that night, after they leave, avalanche comes down and it just knocks the two trains, the passenger train and the mail train, into a ravine. And the wreckage is just, think about how big a train and heavy a train is, and they're just completely mangled. And those trees that are taken out. Now, actually, above where the trains were stuck, there was not a lot of forestation. There'd been a forest fire, actually, the summer before and had burned a lot of the trees down. So there was certainly speculation about that. But you can see that below in the ravine, there were some really big trees. And just, again, the mangled wreckage is really astonishing. And here are some of the victims that were recovered. So a really, really terrible, terrible episode in our history. And again, I want to turn it, like, which is the least depressing picture for you to look at? This one. Okay. So after this happened, and this is an interesting, because it includes people who work for the railroad, but also passengers as well. And one of the men who died, his father decided to sue the railroad in a case that was called Topping versus Great Northern Railway Company. And he was suing for basically compensation for the grandson, so the son who survived, was not on the train, but who had survived his father. There was so much publicity around this. They moved the initial trial to Kings County in Seattle, which of course is not where this happened. And Topping won. He won $20,000, to be awarded $20,000. Well, you can imagine the railroad that's not good for them, because what this does is it opens a door, not just for other survivors of the avalanche, but basically any passenger who is killed while riding on one of their trains. And it's a huge corporation with tons of money, right? And so even though Topping wins in the lower court, the railroad then appeals the case to the Washington State Supreme Court. And again, the volume of documentation that goes along with this is just, it's overwhelming. And there's so many different sort of explanations for why it happened, why people think it happened. Were there stumps above? Had there been a forest fire? Wasn't there a forest fire? What did it look like? What didn't it look like? Did they know there was going to be a slide? Did they not know there was going to be a slide? I mean, it really goes on and on and on and on. But to me, what was the most interesting testimony of all came from the men who worked for the railroad itself. And what they said was, we absolutely believe we know when a snow slide is going to happen. That's something we've worked this mountain division. We're experienced. We know the signs. We know where they've happened before. That's why we build snow sheds. We know when they're going to happen. But we didn't expect this one. And so this one is an act of God. And it's just such a twist of, it seems like they were so, their convictions were so strong that they were unwilling to bend on this. You'd think, oh, the workers would be all behind, like trying to assign liability in this case. But instead, what they said was, we thought where the trains were was safe. We would never have left them there if we didn't think they were safe. And so the sort of irony of the case is Topping ends up not getting the settlement. And again, here's the part of the ruling from Judge Humphreys, who was involved in the case. In order that a phenomenon should be an act of God, it is not necessary that it be unique, that it should happen for the first time. It is enough if it is extraordinary, unprecedented, and could not reasonably be anticipated. So the GN gets off the hook for this. What's interesting, though, is they end up spending millions of dollars. First, they build this concrete snow shed at Wellington. They eventually abandon this route and build a different route to the West Coast because this one is so fraught with avalanche problems. Wellington was renamed Thai for a while, and then obviously when they rebuilt the route, it fell into, it was abandoned. But you can go there. This concrete snow tunnel is still there. So you can drive down, and it's really kind of chilling to try to reconstruct in your mind what happened. It's a very interesting place. So, next time you're going over Stevens Pass, I guess. So that's about all I wanted to talk about today. That was kind of a whirlwind tour through avalanche country. You can buy my book on Amazon, or for your Kindle even. So if you're interested, there's a lot more stories, a lot more detail in here, and I think there's a little bit of time for questions.